In the dark shadows, in the white cold, fearlessly we search for knowledge new and old. We drink the strong spirits and read the ancient tomes. The order of the Abracast. We are the brave and the bold.
The Church of Salvan, Sente de Flora in Lisbon, founded in the 12th century as an Augustinian monastery, was completely rebuilt between 1582 and 1629, long recognized as the centerpiece of the Portuguese cultural patrimony. This imposing structure is both the triumph of Mannerist architectural style and a testimony to the wealth and power of the Portuguese clergy during the glory days of the empire. In a quiet side chapel just off the central nave can be found a discreet stone block marking the tomb of a foreign knight known only as Henry. This simple monument identifies Henry as one of the Jerusalem-bound Crusaders killed in the summer of 1147 while wresting the city of Lisbon from Muslim control. The capture of Lisbon was the only real Christian success of the Second Crusade, and so has become relatively well known. Less widely studied, however, is the remarkable religious cult that has subsequently grew up around Henry and his fallen comrades. Death in battle against non-Christians was for the Crusader highly meritorious act, and many of them believed that a series of miraculous events at Henry's grave confirmed his status as a true martyr. Surviving eyewitness accounts written by Anglo-Norman, Germanic, Flemish, and Portuguese authors provide an unusually nuanced description of the establishment and growing popularity of Salvan Sente de Flora's cult of Henry, the Crusader. Not only do these accounts reveal the shrine to have been an important point of contact between the fledgling Kingdom of Portugal and the later, wider Latin Christian world, they also offer an intriguing insight into the development of the Crusade and the transference of crusading ideology into the Iberian Peninsula. This is from a piece called Miracles, Martyrs, and the Cult of Henry the Crusader in Lisbon by a chap named Stephen Lay. It's going to be a wild one tonight, I think.
The Abracast. Occult, history, conspiracy, and violence.
Recording from my newly sterilized studio. I'm John Towers, and this is the Abracast. Why is your studio newly sterilized? Well, because I feel like I'm getting sick and I'm paranoid. I'm not paranoid. I'm cautiously exploring the idea that I might be virus-ridden. And don't be like, oh, you bitch all the time about quarantine and whatever, and it serves you right. Look, I do bitch about quarantine, but besides, going to the store, I wear my mask. I told you guys I wear my mask. Not that I believe in it, but I don't want to freak everybody else out. I don't want to deal with the drama. So we'll see what happens. It's my experience in these situations that sometimes you don't need hydroxychloroquine. You don't need remdesivir. What you need is a gin jihad served up nice and cold in your vessel of the art. So go ahead, and if you're drinking along with me tonight, raise your vessel of the art. Say thank you to our Patreon supporters, the guys that are supporting our little podcast here. We got a new supporter, Bobby D4L. Bobby D4L. So thank you, sir, for joining in. So, let's see, what are we going to do this evening? We're talking about the Siege of Lisbon, 1 July through 25th of October, 1147. So this has kind of got a little bit of moving parts I feel like I have to set up, right? You know, we mentioned many times on this show that after Muhammad died, there was this rapid expansion of Islam. And in 711, Lisbon was taken by the Muslims. The whole Iberian Peninsula was populated by the Visigoths, as well as some other peoples. But the Muslims went in and just took it over, and they held it for a really long time. So they took Lisbon in 711 with the whole Iberian Peninsula. So the Reconquista, which is kind of like this loose kind of movement to take the Iberian Peninsula back. It's the reconquering. It started not long after. It started in 718. And, 711, it started in 718. Well, 436 years after 711, as part of the Second Crusade, the Reconquista, the Crusaders that were going to the Holy Land sieged Lisbon. Okay, so I'm going to back up just a little bit. During the Neolithic period, the area was inhabited by these pre-Celts, and they built megaliths and dolmens. In the Roman times, the Roman Empire built this wall around the city. In the Middle Ages, after the fall of the Roman Empire, all this other stuff starts taking place. 436 years later, the Crusaders sieged Lisbon. Some historians mark this as the beginning of the end of the Muslim control over Spain. So what we see here is kind of like what we see with the Ottoman Empire in Poland in 1681. You know, the siege of Vienna broke the Ottomans back, but they limped along for quite a while. But this is where it started. So I'm going to be reading. Oh my God, this is so hard to read. It's like fragmented and it's written all weird, but it's a piece of this work called De expugnatione Lyxbonsensi, or On the Conquest of Lisbon. It was written by a chaplain of Herve de Glanville. And I think there's a link that matches Herve de Glanville to Henry the Crusader. I could be wrong about that. So let's get into this De expugnatione Lyxbonsensi. I'm just going to call it the Conquest of Lisbon going forward because I feel like I'm doing the title a disservice. We're just going to jump in here. This is the book. Finally, when we had been besieging the city for 6 weeks, and it had been learned that the enemy were rather hard pressed by hunger, while his untold abundance of bread and wine and fruits was at the hands of our forces, they gradually plucked up their spirits and drew the ships up on dry land and lowered the mast and put the cordage under the hatches as a sign that they were spending the winter. But the men of Cologne 5 times began to dig mines for the purpose of overturning the wall. And whereas many times overwhelmed, hence our forces again had caused for deep discouragement and murmurings much among themselves, they were making such complaints that they might have been better employed elsewhere. After some days, there came to us, by the determination of divine mercy, no small consolation. For in the evening 10 Moors entered a skiff beneath the wall and rowed away. Here we go. Right off the bat, we have some combat engineering happening. They're digging underneath the wall. They're going to crush the wall. This is something that you see in a lot of sieges. So what they do is they dig tunnels underneath the walls, and then they prop them up with wood and tar wood, and then they paint it like with tar, like flammable stuff. And when they get all the way through or halfway through, they light the they light the wood structure that's holding the wall up, and the idea is that when it falls, it creates like a breach through the wall. This is we still use this kind of thing in combat engineering to this day. Of course, not medieval castle walls or whatever, but this is a very practical way to breach an obstacle. In the direction of the castle of Palmilla, but our men pursued them so closely that they abandoned the skiff in desperation, and everything they were carrying in it. Letters were found in it direct to several parties and written in the Arabic language. An example of one, as I got it from an interpreter, is as follows: to Abu Muhammad, king of ever the unfortunate people of Lisbon, may he maintain his kingdom and safety. What great and terrible and unexpected disasters had come upon us in the desolate ruin of our city, and the great effusion of noble blood. Memorials, alas, of our everlasting grief proclaim already the second moon has almost passed since the fleet of the Franks which had been borne hither to our borders, with the aid of heaven and the earth and the sea, has kept us shut within the circuit of this closed, drawn wall. And what is to be hoped for amid the sum of woes is more than doubtful, except only to look for succor by means of ransom. But with our cooperation, we doubt not that you will liberate the city and country from the barbarians, for they are not so very numerous or warlike as their tower and their engines, which have burned with the force and arms, bear witness. Otherwise, let your prudence beware, for the same outcome of events and evils await you. And the other letters besought the same thing from parents and other relatives and friends, and from debtors, and besides they besought them to pray for them to Allah, that is God. In the least, he would not permit them at the moment of death to be cheated for that eternal retreat in which his beloved Mohammed dwells in glory. They also gave information concerning their supply of bread and other foodstuffs. When our men learned of these things, their spirits were greatly encouraged to continue the attack against the enemy for some days longer. After a short time, the corpse of a man who had been drowned was found beneath our ships. And on an arm a letter was tied, of which the tenor was as follows: The King of Evero unto the men of Lisbon, liberty of action, having long since entered into a truce with the King of the Portuguese, I cannot break faith and wage war upon him and his people. For the rest, take heed in good time by safety with your money, lest that prove a cause of your hurt, taught to be a cause of your well-being. So they're gaining intelligence. So they found a messenger from a local Muslim ruler who, so the Muslims in Lisbon reached out to this other king, or this other whatever out there, and he's saying, look, I can't help you because I have a pact with the Portuguese king. I think that's super interesting. You get to see kind of like the internal politics playing here. Farewell, give something worthwhile to this our messenger. So finally, as the Moors' last hope of relief was destroyed, our men kept watch the more vigilantly. A part of our army returned from the castle of Sintra with a great quantity of booty. For the nature of the site prevented them from attempting an assault upon the castle or a siege while we were carrying on the foregoing operations. The king dismissed all of his own forces except a small number of knights and officers of his household, having either sold his provisions or sent them to Santa Am. Only the Bishop of Oporto remained constantly with us until the surrender of the city. So this is good. what they're saying is they refuse to divide their forces, which we all know is a bad idea. Meanwhile, the Moors, being hard-pressed by hunger whenever any of their poor were able to do so secretly, they gave themselves up to our men, and so it soon came about that the acts and the plans of the enemy could be but little concealed from us. And then our men, attending more strictly the siege, began to dig, here we go, a subterranean mine between the tower and the port, to death level in order that they might bring down the wall when this had been discovered, for it was quite accessible to the enemy. It proved greatly to our detriment after the investment of the city for many days were consumed in its vain defense. Besides, 2 Balearic Magna's L's were set up by our forces, one on the riverbank, which was operated by seamen, the other in front of the Portal de Ferrol, which was operated by the knights and their table companions, all these men having been divided into groups of 100. On a given signal, the first 100 retired and the other took their place, so that within the space of 10 hours, 5,000 stones were hurled, and the enemy were greatly harassed by this action against the Normans and the English, and those who were with them began the erection of a movable tower, 83 feet in height, once more with the view to bring down the wall. The men of Cologne and Flemings began to dig mines beneath the wall of the stronghold higher up, a mine which marvelously to relate had 5 entrances and extended inside to a depth of 40 cubits from the front, and they had completed it within a month. Meanwhile, hunger and the stench of corpses greatly tormented the enemy, for there was no burial space within the city, and for food they collected the refuse which was thrown out from our ships and borne up by the waves beneath their walls. And a ridiculous incident occurred as a result of their hunger, when some of the Flemings, while keeping guard among the ruins of houses, were eating figs, and having had enough, left some laying about unconsumed. When this was discovered by 4 of the Moors, they came up stealthily and cautiously, like birds approaching food. And when the Flemings observed this, they frequently scattered refuse of this sort about in order that they might lure them out with bait. And finally, having set snares in the accustomed places, they caught 3 of the Moors in them, and thereby caused enormous merriment among us when the wall had been undetermined inflammable material had been placed within the mine and lighted. The same night at cockcrow, about 30 cubits of the wall crumbled to the ground, when the Moors who were guarding the wall were heard to cry out in anguish that they might now make an end of their long labors, and this very day would be their last, and that it would have to be divided with death, and that this would be their greatest consolation for death. If, without fearing it, they might exchange their lives for ours. For it was necessary to go yonder whence there was no need of returning, and if a life were well ended, it would nowhere be said to have been cut short, for what matter was not how long, but how well a life had been lived, and a life would have lasted as long as it should, even though it's not as long as it naturally could provide. It closed in a fitting end, and so the Moors gathered from all sides for a defense of the breach in the wall, placing against it a barrier of beams. Accordingly, when the men of Cologne and Flemings went out to attempt an entrance, they were repulsed. For although the wall had collapsed, the nature of the situation up the steep hillside prevented any entry merely by the heap of ruins. But when they failed to overcome the defenders in hand-to-hand encounter, they attacked them furiously from a distance with arrows so that they looked like hedgehogs. As bristling with bolts, they stood immovably at the defense and endured as if unharmed. Thus, the defense was maintained against an onslaught of the attackers until the first hour of the day, when the latter retired to camp in the Normans and the English came under arms to take the struggle in place of their associates. Supposing that an entrance would be easy now that the enemy were wounded and exhausted, but they were prevented by the leaders of the Flemings and the men of Cologne who had sailed with them with insults, and demanded that we attempt an entrance in any way it might be accomplished with our own engines. For they said that they had prepared the breach which now stood open for themselves, not for us. So for several days they were altogether repulsed from the breach. All right, we're going back to this Miracles, Martyrs, and the Cult of Henry, the Crusader in Lisbon. And I just kind of jump in it here. Even before the Council of Clairvaux, the Holy See had attempted to support the military efforts of the Spanish Christians through the provision of spiritual benefits to bolster frontier defenses, or by encouraging French knights to assist in Spanish campaigns. Following the success for the First Crusade, these efforts were redoubled, and the conceptual link between the Spanish and Palestinian campaigns strengthened. So remember, this is, if you look at it, is in the term of like a modern war. This is a war being fought on now 3 fronts. They're pushing to Jerusalem. There's this thing going on in the Balkans, which we talked about the last Crusade episodes, and now here's this thing in the Iberian Peninsula. By the time of the First Lateran Council, which is 1123, the assembled churchmen were able to agree that vows taken for the defense of either Spain or the Holy Land should be equally binding. Spiritual rewards comparable to those offered for the defense of Jerusalem were granted to participants, be they Iberian or French or Italian, and Spanish-led campaigns against Muslim strongholds in the Balearic Islands, among the Mediterranean coast, and in the Embro Valley. Ecclesiastical enthusiasm for holy war reached a peak in 1145 with the declaration of the Second Crusade by Pope Eugenius III. Many of the personalities behind this effort, most notably Bernard of Clairvaux, we talked about him a lot, appear to have envisaged the expedition not as an armed pilgrimage, but rather than a coordinated Christian campaign against enemies on all sides. Ecclesiastical assurances were one thing. However, widespread acceptance of the vision of the secular knighthood was quite another, despite the efforts of the senior clergy to equate the journey to Jerusalem with the other theaters of operations, including those in Spain. In practice, many pilgrims remained uncertain. Bishop Pedro Petitos of Porto were welcomed the newly arrived Crusaders to Portugal in 1147, recognized these lingering doubts in the men before him, and he attempted to meet them directly. To you, the Mother Church, as it were, with her arms cut off and her face disfigured, appeals for help. She seeks vengeance in your hands for the blood of her sons, and therefore be not seduced by the desire to press on with the journey which you have begun. For the praiseworthy thing is not to have been to Jerusalem, but to live a good life on the way. For you cannot arrive there except in the performance of God's work. Bishop Pedro then put on an ecclesiastical conception of the crusade to the sternest of tests by instructing his impromptu congregation that God's work would be to join with the local Portuguese troops in an attack on the Muslim-held Lisbon. The bishop's audience was a fractious one, and not all of them were easily swayed. The Crusader fleet was in fact a conglomerate force made up of contingents from across northern Europe, while the German and the Flemish soldiers reacted positively to the Portuguese request. A number of the Anglo-Normans, particularly the English, were strident in their opposition. Uppermost among their concerns was a distrust for the Portuguese leader, the self-proclaimed King Alfonso Henriques, 1128 to 1185. But they also argued that the prevailing easterly winds could not last, and the more lucrative opportunities for piracy would be found closer to Jerusalem. The argument became so heated that it seemed for the Anglo-Norman contingent might ultimately be forced to break up, for beneath the readily apparent issues of the xenophobic animosity and hope for material gain, there seems to have been an undercurrent of feeling among the English that their primary concern as pilgrims should be to reach the Holy Land, and that wayside operations in obedience to the tenets of the Holy War were not in themselves adequate justification for the delay. It was then piety or cupidity that lay behind the dispute, the reaction of the different groups to the very real possibility of dying before the walls of Lisbon can bring us closer to an answer to this critical question. Many of the northern mariners considered those of their comrades who were killed during the siege to be martyrs. This was a conviction that had wide implications. A belief in martyrdom for the faith lay at the very center of conventional medieval piety. Yet, traditionally, this form of spiritual commitment had been a passive act in the face of a deadly persecution. The aggressive martyrdom of the holy warrior was a more problematic concept. Early popes had faced many enemies, and they used various forms of exhortation and encouragement to rouse soldiers to the defense of the Holy See. During the late 11th century, reformist popes had sought to bind secular knights more closely to their cause and conspicuously reward those who died in their service. One early and highly controversial example was Arambard, the violent leader of the Pateria movement in Milan. Erlembod, an enthusiastic supporter of Pope Gregory VII, was killed in 1075 while battling the Pope's ecclesiastical enemies. Gregory declared the fallen knight a martyr and gave papal countenance to the tales and the miracles occurring at his tomb. 2 decades later, in 1095, Pope Urban II reinforced the martyr status by arranging to have his relics transferred to Rome. The declaration of the First Crusade in that same year gave the question of the spiritual status of soldiers killed in battle against the Pope's enemies an even greater urgency. All this comes into play later. I'm sorry to drag you through it all. Yet, there was no simple answer. Although the relationship between the fallen Crusader and the more traditional martyr quickly blurred, an important distinction did remain. The reward enjoyed by Crusaders, whether constructed by the individual as a remission of sins or merely of penance, was in effect a papal promise that drew on the authority of the pontiff himself. The crown of the martyr, on the other hand, was a privilege granted directly from heaven. It was a special status that can only be made manifest by the type of miracle Colin Morris has termed a visionary insurance. The distinction between papal promise and divine demonstration has important implications when applied to the cult of crusading martyrs at Lisbon. Unlike the martyr status accorded to Arambard by Pope Gregory, the veneration of martyrs at Lisbon was a grassroots expression of popular piety. It was the comrades of the Crusaders rather than senior ecclesiastics accompanying them. Who first drew attention to the miraculous occurrence at Henry's grave? Moreover, even though the cult never gained official recognition outside Lisbon, a belief that fallen soldiers were martyrs was tantamount to the endorsement of the papal conception of the Crusade for a visionary assurance provided to surviving soldiers that their comrades were secure in paradise. It also provided to the highest possible sanction of those who believed. Their duty as Crusaders went beyond the successful completion of a pilgrimage to include the obligation to assist threatened co-religionists along the way. What is less clear, however, is the degree to which the various contingents who took part in the siege actually believed that the miracles had occurred.
Learn more at abracast.com. Get bonus content by signing up for the mailing list. Get all that, plus many exclusive episodes by supporting the show at patreon.com or subscribestar.com.
Well, hello, kitties. Are you looking for a frightfully spooky podcast? The crew from Hill City Paranormal has a treat for you then. Listen to calls from our haunted hotline, interviews, and behind-the-scenes commentary from our investigations, and even some fictional stories that are guaranteed to send chills up your spine. Subscribe to Hill City Paranormal wherever you listen to your podcasts. And you've been warned.
The creation of a cult. Eyewitness accounts of the miraculous. Once all the newly arrived Crusaders were at last reconciled to the idea of assisting the Portuguese, and a formal agreement had been reached with Alfonso Henriques concerning the terms of their association, the besieging armies took up position around Lisbon. The Anglo-Normans established camp to the west of the city, and the Germans and the Flemish to the east, and the Portuguese royal troops were stationed to the north. On July the 1st, 1147, the attack began in earnest. The Crusaders suffered their first casualties. Cemeteries for the fallen soldiers were laid out close to their respective camps, and the two commemorative churches, Santa Maria dos Mortes and the Anglo-Normans, and the São Vicente de Flora for the Germans and Flemish, were subsequently constructed to honor the dead. Reports of a number of miraculous events at São Vicente de Fora soon began to enliven the routine of camp life. Yet, just as specific groups of Crusaders had reacted differently to the Portuguese pleas for assistance, so too the claims that marvels had been witnessed in the cemeteries to the east of the city did not meet with immediate or universal acceptance. The miracles attributed to the Crusader martyrs took place around the German and Flemish graves. The descriptions written by compatriots of the fallen soldiers recalled these events in some detail. 3 letters penned by Germanic Crusaders at Lisbon are extant, although they are similar enough to suggest that some form of collusion took place in their composition. The briefest of these communiques, sent by Winid to Archbishop Arnold of Cologne, concludes on the satisfying note of victory. Susan Eddington has argued convincingly that Winid's letter was in fact the original, and was subsequently used as a model by the other 2 authors. One of these derivative texts was sent by Enolf to Bishop Mayau of Thruaine, and the second by Doodlechin of Lackenstein, was addressed to Abbot Kuno of Disembodiburg. Arnulf and Doodlechin both added some details and personal glosses to Wynid's basic text, extending their narratives beyond the fall of the city to include descriptions of the marvels that took place within the Crusaders' camp, because each of these authors described the miracles using distinctive language. It seems likely that here, at least, they did not draw upon a common source or upon each other to complete their accounts. Indeed, Doodlechin readily reveals his own source of information, for he claims to have witnessed these events with his own eyes and touched it with his own hands. From their separate perspectives, Doodlechin and Arnulf provided almost identical accounts of the miracles in the cemetery. Doodlechin recalled the burial of the fallen soldiers are martyrs, Martyrum Nostriorum, as he called them, and described the subsequent appearance to the faithful mysterious nocturnal lights around the newly dug graves. The resulting spiritual excitement rose even higher when two men who had been mute since birth were miraculously hailed. Doodlechin noted with considerable satisfaction the dates on which these marvels took place. The first miracle occurred on October 10th, the feast day of Saint Guérin, a soldier saint much revered in Cologne. The second mute was healed on the first day of November, All Saints' Day. Arnulf, for his part, recorded much of the same series of events, although he added the further information that the second mute received a vision in which a glorious figure led him by the hand to the martyr's tomb, there to receive his blessing. Arnulf was in complete agreement that Doodlechin, on points such as the dates when these events took place, and he also sought to portray the martyrs as their close comrades, fraterum nostrarum. Similarly, neither author betrayed any doubts concerning the spiritual rewards enjoyed by their comrades or the correctness of the decision to fight in Lisbon. In this respect, it is also significant that Doodlechin felt the need to extend his account to include their ultimate arrival in the Holy Land. This high level of confidence in the legitimacy of their cause presents a striking contrast to the more ambivalent impression given by the Anglo-Norman account of the same events. The Anglo-Norman perspective at Lisbon was revealed to be an extended letter that has come to be known as, well, we know, you're going to make me try to fucking pronounce it again, De expugnatione Lyxbonsensi, the Conquest of Lisbon. This is what I read from at the beginning of the episode. The identity of this author has been a subject of long-running debate, but Harold Livermore's suggestion of an Anglo-Norman priest named Raoul has been widely accepted. The description provided by Raoul of the marvelous events that took place within the camp is significantly different to that found in the letters of either Arnulf or Doodlechin. Raoul briefly noted the foundation of cemeteries outside Lisbon and the construction of churches to commemorate the fallen Crusaders. The healing of two mutes during the siege warranted only a few terse words, and Raoul did not elaborate at all on the circumstances surrounding these events. Certainly, the healing of the two Crusaders was not attributed to the intervention of their martyred comrades. Indeed, martyr is not a term that Raoul used. Instead, he saved his attention for another series of miraculous events altogether. In the final days of the siege, the camp was disturbed by unnerving portents when the bread used by the Flemings to celebrate the Mass appeared to be permeated with blood. This terrifying omen continued for a long number of days, even after the city had fallen, and Raoul recalled the reaction of his Anglo-Norman comrades. Some interpreting it, I don't know why he's C-3PO, why I'm making him sound like C-3PO all of a sudden. Some interpreting it sounds as this fierce and indomitable people, the Flemings, covetous of the goods of others. Although there, I'm out of C-3PO. Although at the moment, under the guise of the pilgrimage and religion, had not put away the thirst for human blood. The thirst for human blood. This portent then led the least some of the Anglo-Normans to conclude that warfare against the Muslims could not be viewed as in itself meritorious. In effect, their acceptance of this miracle of the bloodied bread brought them to a diametrically opposite view to that reached by the Germans and the Flemish on the bias of the miracles attributed to the martyrs. Indeed, Raoul's suggestion is that due to the temptations of greed, the actions of the Crusaders at Lisbon might even be injurious to their own spiritual well-being. That the goods taken were held by Muslims, in no way excused for their forcible seizure from the stain of covetousness, even when the booty was to be used to support the pious action of the pilgrims. A commonly held, if sometimes unstated, opinion concerning the author of the Conquest of Lisbon, or the De Expugnatione Lyxbonsensi, is that he himself in favor of the Crusaders' decision to undertake the Siege of Lisbon, and that his sympathies lay with those who believed it was their duty to assist the Portuguese in the attack. Motherfucking Harold Livermore has gone so far as to suggest that the letter itself was written in an attempt to justify the decision to delay their pilgrimage at the siege. However, a consideration of Raoul's unusual treatment of the miraculous events within the camp revealed a more equivocal attitude behind his work. The description of these events by Arnulf and Doodlechin make it clear that news of the miraculous healing spread rapidly through the crusading armies, yet Raoul barely mentions this excitement. Besides the support of a miracle-working martyr who would undoubtedly provide any effort to justify the decisions to remain in Lisbon. This is even more surprising given that the second of the healings took place on All Saints' Day, the festival that had special significance for the Anglo-Norman contingent. On this day, as Raoul himself records, the English priest Gilbert of Hastings was elected bishop of the newly captured city of Lisbon. Yet the healing of a mute crusader, which could so easily have been construed as a divine approbation of this event, was passed over in silence. Instead, when Raoul alludes to the miraculous, far from using supernatural events to establish the justice of the Crusaders' own cause, the striking image of the blood-stained bread actually highlighted the essential tension that lay at the heart of the crusading ideology itself. Raoul, then, in common with many of his Anglo-Norman comrades, seemed to have harbored many unresolved doubts concerning his experiences in Portugal. In the crucible of the Siege of Lisbon, two distinct attitudes towards the practice of the crusade emerged. The German and the Flemish mariners eagerly accepted the Portuguese request for assistance and were prepared to believe that martyrdom would be the reward of those who fell during the attack. However, many of the Anglo-Normans appeared more tentative, dismaying deep reservations about any halt in their pilgrimage, and doubts as to whether military operations at Lisbon could be morally justified. How are such fundamental differences to be explained? One reason for the divergent attitude between the Anglo-Norman and the Continental Crusaders may well have been the degree of contact the general population and the two religions had with the most recent developments in crusading ideology. Our boy, Bernard of Clairvaux, the force behind recruitment for the Second Crusade, embarked on extensive personal preaching tours of both Flanders and the Rhineland, which we've talked about, but was unable to cross the channel. Hence, they're blaming it on this dude. They're blaming the division on Clairvaux because he couldn't cross the channel to preach to the Anglo-Normans, I guess. I think that's fascinating. Hence, while the German and the Flemish were exposed to the newest ways of ecclesiastical thinking, the English remained relatively insulated from these influences. Indeed, the Bishop of Porto recognized this and praised the Anglo-Normans for embarking without the urging of any preacher, with the zeal of the law of God in their hearts, led by the impulse of the Holy Spirit. Perhaps for this very reason, the conception of the Crusade was an older one, in which a more traditional emphasis on pilgrimage had by no means been subsumed into the clerically sanctioned violence of holy war. What then of the other Christian force participating in the attack on Lisbon prior to the Second Crusade? Senior Portuguese ecclesiastics exchanged messages and possibly gifts with our boy Bernard of Clairvaux in his role as the head and spiritual leader of the Cistercian order. Nevertheless, recent suggestions that Bernard contacts with Portugal were more profound, extending even into collusion with Alfonso Henriques, and his expansionist plans seem to have been overstated, while such contacts were theoretically possible on a number of individuals known to have made the long journey over the Pyrenees. The hypothesis of close communications between our boy Bernard of Clairvaux and the King of Portugal, Alfonso Henriques, rests rather precariously on a single document, usually referred to as letter number 308, its authenticity of which has not been universally accepted. Moreover, those individuals who did not make the journey to the courts of Europe were primarily senior ecclesiastics. There is no evidence of local preaching tours being undertaken, and it would seem likely that the only direct exposure the majority of Portuguese had to the developing ideology of the Crusade was from their interaction with the visiting Crusaders themselves, in the face of confusing, even self-contradictory beliefs displayed by the different contingents of the Northern Fleet. How might the local Portuguese have responded? Although no strictly contemporary description of the Siege of Lisbon from Portuguese perspective survives, it is possible to glimpse something of local attitudes through the prism of Raoul's account in the the Conquest of Lisbon, expugnatione Lyxbonsensi, describes an embassy of Alfonso Henriques sent to the citizens of Lisbon in an effort to secure their surrender through negotiation. The ambassadors adopted a legalistic rather than sectarian approach, appealing to the nebulous claims of the prior ownership and the pragmatics of realpolitik. Yet, perhaps most revealing is the unequivocal rejection of the offer which Raoul attributes to the Muslim elder. Labeling your ambition zeal for righteousness, you misrepresent vices and virtues, for your greed has already grown to such proportion that base deeds not only please you, but even delight you. you would judge us to exile and destitution in order for you to become famous. Some onlookers, Raoul amongst them, rather than being impelled by either piety or ideology, Alfonso Enriquez simply pursued his own long-standing. This is one of those books they got a lot of this backwards, right? I don't want to get into it, but there's like new speak all over this thing. I've been trying to be cool about it, but this is it. Okay. All right. Alfonso Enriquez simply pursued his own long-standing expansionist ambitions. For, in common with many frontier communities, the Portuguese adopted a ready pragmatism when dealing with non-Christian groups. To Alfonso and his subjects, their Muslim neighbors were no more mysterious or alien than the Crusaders themselves. A detailed knowledge of Muslim language and customs had proved decisive in Portuguese surprise attacks on nearby Santarém in March 1147. Furthermore, Alfonso was punctilious in abiding by the agreements made with Muslim leaders. And although the use of such treaties was able to effectively isolate Lisbon from outside support, overall, throughout the siege, the Portuguese were wary of extreme measures and quick to attempt compromise wherever possible. It seems likely that their attitude towards the Crusader saints would have been more akin to that of a skeptical Anglo-Normans than the fervent Flemings and Germans. As time passed, however, the presence of the Crusader saints became more familiar. There are indication that these attitudes began to converge. All right, I'm John. This is the Advertise. Thank you guys. Hope you enjoyed the show. I'll let Hilda tell you what to do.
Thank you for listening to this episode. Send an email or visit us on social media to let us know what you think about this topic. And please remember to leave a 5-star rate and review.
Hey, did you learn something? Did you laugh? Supporting me is a way for you to be a part of the Abercast and ensure its growth and sustainability. It also means I can create a normal schedule for shows and bonus shows, as well as the exclusive Fellowcraft episodes. By supporting the show, you are not only a listener, but you are a part of the show. You supporting the show gives me a way to offer fun rewards as a thank you for showing your appreciation and support for our projects. Do you have an idea for a reward that you don't see? Let me know. My supporters are my partners. I currently pay for you to listen to the Abercast. Not only do I pay the hosting bills out of my own pocket, I volunteer my time and talent to each and every episode of the Abercast. The price of books, the time and resources of reading and researching, the massive amounts of gin and tonic needed, the equipment it takes to record the shows, the time and resources it takes to create the bonus material, and the cost to maintain the internet presence. Is it worth your support? I don't know. I'm proud of the Abercast, and I feel like I'm improving all the time. In addition to creating the show that you dig and that you are excited about, I also have a full-time commitment and other obligations. So why financial support? All of the supporters help me focus my time on the quality and development of the podcast. And what if you can't afford, $1 or $3 or $10 or whatever a month? Believe me, I get that. There are many degrees of support, but if you can't support the show financially, please consider leaving a 5-star rate and review on your preferred podcast app. And don't forget that you can sign into the mailing list and still unlock a lot of bonus content. Thank you. I cannot put into words how much it means to me that you listen to the show each time I post a new episode. Your feedback, support, and love of the stories that we talk about here is what keeps me going.